Okay, let's start on our next piece from our Baroque playlist in our Listening Help podcast. I want to make a quick a note here before we start a piece, and this is probably going to give some information away just by saying this, but as we've said before, vocal music can be voices alone, or it can be voices with instruments. And as you know from our playlist, some of our vocal pieces, where it's a voice and orchestra or choir and orchestra, the orchestra will have some lengthy passages where they're playing by themselves. The singers don't sing. So I wanted to point out two things. A, I don't do trick questions. So if I am playing an excerpt on a listening exam and it's a piece of vocal music, you are going to hear voices. That said, you might not hear them right away. They'll be there, but they might not be in the first few seconds of the piece. So it's not a bad idea before you leap into answering a question, an identification question. Not a bad idea to let it play a little while, just to make sure you are clear about whether or not voices are going to kick in. So now that said, here in our podcast, we don't really have the time for that. So we're going to assume that these first 5 to 10 seconds or so that I play for you are all you need to hear. So with that in mind, here is our first piece. All right, now I said first piece. I really shouldn't have said that, but the reason I said that is it's our first instrumental piece because this is a piece of instrumental music. Now, as I say, if this were a listening exam, you'd probably want to let this file play a little longer. But for the sake of time right now, we're just gonna kind of give that away. This is instrumental music. There are no voices playing. So right away, you eliminate any operas, oratorios, and cantatas on the playlist from consideration. This ain't one of them. This must be one of the concertos or the sonata or some other one of the other instrumental genres. So, having narrowed it down to instruments only, let's talk about other things that we know. We are not hearing a solo instrument. By that I mean you're not hearing. This piece is not. It's not just one instrument. That's what I'm trying to say. We can hear some strings. There's a harpsichord. And there's a flute. So we can rule out. I'll turn that down. We can rule out some of the genres that involve a single instrument, like the organ fugue, like the cello suite. And if we listen to this moment coming up here in just a sec, we've got a fair number of violins playing there, at least at times. So what we have here is an orchestra. Granted, a Baroque-size orchestra, not the gargantuan orchestras we're used to in the 19th century, but this is an orchestral piece. So we can eliminate chamber music as well. Chamber music pieces are for just a handful of instruments, and this is more than that. So right there, by knowing it's just instruments, and by knowing that we have an orchestral ensemble, Baroque-sized though it may be, we've narrowed it down to just a couple possibilities. We've got Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. We've got Handel's A la Hornpipe from the Water Music. And we've got Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons. Those are our three choices for instrumental works that involve orchestra. So just by hearing those few characteristics, we've narrowed it down to three. Now, What do we know about those three pieces? We know that two of them are concertos. The Vivaldi Spring and the Bach Brandenburg Concerto are different kinds of concertos, but concertos nonetheless. So they involve a contrast between either a solo instrument and orchestra, just one solo instrument the whole way through, a small group of soloists versus the full orchestra, that would be a concerto grosso. Or in the case of the orchestral suite, the water music, it's that's just for full orchestra. There's nothing in a suite that necessitates there being instruments that are featured, but luckily for us, in the water music, that is exactly what happens. That movement is called a la hornpipe, and so there are some very prominent passages given to the trumpets and the horns. So let's listen a little more to this piece and see if we hear any of those things. Do we hear a solo violin over and over and over again like we would hear in spring? Do we hear solos being passed around between a small group of soloists, a violin, flute, and harpsichord, like we would in the concerto grosso? Or do we hear some prominent passages for brass instruments, for horns, as we would expect to hear in the suite by Handel? So we ask ourselves, what's prominent? What's really sticking out? What's the composer putting right in my face? And I think we can safely say that it's not horns. I don't hear any brass there. No trumpets, no French horns. So we can rule out the Handel suite, the a la hornpipe from the water music. So there's one down of our three orchestral pieces. We're down to the two concertos. And as we said, the Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the spring, and this movement of spring we have on our playlist is a violin concerto. So we have solo violin versus orchestra, back and forth, back and forth. And we're not really hearing that here. We are hearing it being passed back and forth. Sometimes it's flute that's prominent, sometimes it's violin that's prominent, and sometimes it's harpsichord. Now this is really unusual. Harpsichord was, in an orchestral piece like this, was part of the continuo. It was background, it was accompaniment. But Bach, in this Brandenburg concerto, and because he was such a rockin' harpsichord player, put the harpsichord front and center. So, we can eliminate the Vivaldi Spring. Vivaldi's Spring, excuse me, as we said before, is solo violin concerto. So when there is a single instrument brought to the fore, it's the violin. That's not what we're hearing. Right now we're hearing a harpsichord being brought to the forefront. Earlier it was a flute. So this can't be Vivaldi's Spring. This must be Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, first movement, Allegro. Now, I took you through the process of elimination there, starting with, is it instrumental or vocal? And then going, is it solo or is it orchestral? But if you hear this, I mean, that's crazy. That's just insanely difficult to play. It is Eddie Van Halen, but for the harpsichord. And if you hear that, you can skip all that process of elimination. If you hear harpsichord